9/11 attacks with writer Reza Aslan in this session sponsored by the Hindu series. Please welcome them.
Thank you. Sorry we are a little bit late. We got caught in the traffic coming from the other side of the festival.
Apologies for being late, but you know, without wanting to make an easy analogy, the sense of crowding when we came here was not dissimilar to 9/11. People felt absolutely asphyxiated, and coming here was like that. You just couldn't move one way or another. So in some way, it's a fitting start to this issue. I'm just going to say a couple of words, and then we just have a free-flowing conversation, and then move out to you. You know, I was thinking that being in the States when 9/11 happened, as indeed you were too, it was very difficult for Europeans to understand the impact of it, because they had had long histories of terrorist attacks. But the difference between their IRA terrorism or the Spanish or Italian terrorism or the Germans in the 60s, the difference between that and what happened at 9/11 was the fact that those acts of terrorism came out of long movements. Either they were liberation movements or they were terrorist movements. This attack seemed, I don't know whether you'd agree with me, and I just want to put this to you for discussion, seemed to me initially as an event, a concrete, tragic event without a framework around it. It was very difficult to put it in a context.
It was certainly difficult for Americans to put in context. The United States is in many ways like an island. You know, we think of ourselves as separate from the rest of the world. Most Americans, as you know, never travel outside of the United States. Our former president, George W. Bush, didn't even have a passport when he became president. He'd been to one foreign country in his entire life before he became the leader of the free world. That was Mexico. So for us, it is true that there was a rude awakening for a lot of Americans. It was an imposition of the outside world upon the United States. This was a foreign attack on our shores, something that we haven't experienced since the bombing of Pearl Harbor in the Second World War. And so I think that had a lot to do with the way that it created this fundamental shift in the psyche of Americans, which has had, of course, ripples in culture, in literature, certainly as we're talking about, in film, in music, etc.
You know, you're right. The U.S. has never seen itself as a victim. You know, since Pearl Harbor, it's always seen itself as actually out there, either protecting others or protecting itself. And I think that's one of the problems in American foreign policy. You know, this whole notion of preemption. You always have to be one step ahead to see who is attacking you, and that creates a kind of paranoia that many empires have had. But there is a difference, I think. I'd suggest to you, the difference is that this group, which had been, you know, through the Clinton years been followed, was not a national entity. This was not an army. You know, all the problems that came up, the ethical, moral, legal problems that came up in Guantanamo Bay eventually when they had all these alleged terrorists there, I think what it did was to create a sense that who is the enemy? You know, this kind of this problem, who is the enemy? One other thing I'd just like to add to our conversation is that if you read the poetry that came out of 9/11, and at Harvard I did a 1.5 hour or 2 hour kind of remembrance of 9/11, and I put together for that a number of writings. If you read the literature and the poetry, there is a sense not only that this is a terrorist attack, but that something about everyday life has been disrupted.
Right.
The ordinariness of everyday life. And it's very interesting. I just want to read two little bits of poems just to illustrate this notion of everyday life. One comes from a poem written by Jory Graham, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. And this is from the American point of view. And then I just read one verse from an English poet. And in both cases, of course, the American is 9/11, and the British poet is responding to the 7/7 attack in Britain. In both poems, there is this sense that everyday life, the thing we depend on, the routines that are part of our everyday maps, the family home that we come to, the friends that we have, the neighbors that we count on, that notion of the everyday, that notion of the ordinary has been disrupted. It was not just that a big national history had been disrupted. It was also, and I think this is one of the very interesting things that the poets have to give. She says, and I'll just read it, the building blocks of the normal, full of flying windows, the flower pots crossing the fleeing photographs, the birds, the finally emptying drawers. I saw a shower of pens falling faster than the papers, slower than the young girl falling. Books facing downwards, wings out, chairs on their backs and the down-going vases cradling their water mid-air, one still gripping its silent bouquet, gloves, trays, uneaten sandwiches, the radio falling, transmitting the Mozart, the hat's long zigzag, the one high-heeled shoe. You know, so often we've seen that illustration of the people jumping, and here she takes the everyday objects of an office or a home and shows it. This just to illustrate this idea that it was the notion of the ordinary and the everyday that was disrupted. And one small verse from a poem written by John Siddiqui in Britain, 9:47, the peak of the morning rush is beginning to subside. Though the tube is closed, so he's taking the bus to work. A woman at the front of the bus is on her way to her course. There is a girl on her way to the dentist and a cleaner on her way home. A bus full of people like this and more. 9:47 lasts forever and ticks on the rest of us before and after the application of words. So I just wanted you to, I wanted us to talk about this disruption of everyday life.
This is it's certainly a common theme. I'm thinking specifically about Don DeLillo's, the great American writer Don DeLillo's 9/11 book called Falling Man. There's a very famous line in there in which someone says that everything is now measured by after. This notion that everything has changed. I think that that's more of an artistic sentiment than it is reality. Yes, immediately after 9/11, we said over and over again, the world has changed, everything has changed, nothing will ever go back to normal, until about 2 weeks later and everything went back to normal. We talked about how 9/11 was going to create a new generation of Americans who were not going to be insulated, who were not going to be isolated from the rest of the world, who were going to be integrated about the world, who were going to understand that the things happening over there actually matter over here. That lasted about 2 weeks. We said that 9/11 was going to change the political dialogue in the United States. No more these petty, ridiculous, partisan bickerings over nonsense, that we were going to come together and deal with issues that are important, that have long-lasting events. That lasted about 2 days. My fundamental question here that I think is something that we should talk about, because we're here to talk about the way that literature, that culture, the arts were affected by 9/11, and that is a very complex discussion. There are lots of things that we can talk about, because after all, it's the role of the artist to not just reflect, but actually define society, define culture. And so artists are going to be preoccupied with these fundamental shifts in society, in our culture, in our psyches, that events like 9/11 and the events of 7/7 and so many other events around the world have fostered, the events of 26/11 here and in Mumbai. But I think that ultimately on the ground, I have a hard time finding out how America is any different today, except for the security state that we've built. Except for the fact that I can't go to a library and check out a book without the CIA finding out what book I'm interested in reading. Besides that, what has actually changed? Is it actually true that nothing is the same since that day? No, I don't think that's true at all.
Well, it is not, of course, things don't change in that way overnight. And I think the general political, geopolitical stance of America has not changed. I think that's right. But my sense is that what we need to do is to see how we can make interventions in order to make certain changes. And I think that's what the artists have been doing. Now, when we talk about the security state, I think that's a very important issue, because security now, the world over, and particularly in the American empire, security is not merely a public policy. Security is not merely about international politics. Security is the way in which culture is defined. And the book I'm writing is called Culture and Security. If in the 19th century, other countries in the age of empire, other countries were judged according to their potential for progress and development, I think what is happening today is other countries are being judged on the basis of whether their security apparatus is important. So in all these literary works, Saturday you mentioned by Ian McEwan, or Amy Walden's submissions in a number of these writings, what is important is the security state is actually now becoming part not only of public politics, but of the individual psyche. It's becoming part of the family. You know, this struck me when I saw the film Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Do you know? Yeah. Have you seen the film Mr. and Mrs. Smith? Mr. and Mrs. Smith is about a couple, both of whom are employed by security firms. They don't know it. Husband and wife are sent to different missions and eventually find that they've been detailed to kill each other. And then, of course, the battle rages in the home. And you remember how they open a kitchen drawer and an entire arsenal emerges. So I think increasingly, and I wanted to put this to you, that the notion of security is not now a public policy issue. It is becoming a domestic issue, both in the political sense and also in the psychic sense. That seems to be one of the most dangerous things that we are facing.
Well, I think it's absolutely true. You bring up a very, very good point here, and this actually, in many ways, is the fundamental challenge of the artist and the writer, is when you're confronted with these big events, say 9/11, as an artist, as a writer, you can't write about those events. You can't. That's for the journalist. That's for the historian. It's for the cultural commentator to do. As I always tell my students, stories are not about events. Stories are about people. And so the fundamental challenge of the writer is, how do you take such a big event and write about it in the smallest way possible? So we mentioned Ian McEwan's wonderful 9/11 book, Saturday, which is not about 9/11, nor is it about 7/7. It's about the experience of one individual in a single day planning for a party. It's a kind of I'd say post 9/11 Mrs. Dalloway, sort of. You talked about Amy Waldman's wonderful book, Submission, my favorite 9/11 book, in which a panel trying to judge who will win, what architect will win the opportunity to make the design for the 9/11 memorial. It's a blind judgment, a blind trial, and the person who wins it, once they open the envelope, they realize his name is Mohammed Khan. Whoops, and all hell breaks loose. And books like that, and even Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, they're not about 9/11. They're about the lives of ordinary individuals dealing with the security state, dealing with the aftermath of this psychic trauma. And I think that, in a sense, that is sort of the principal task of the writer anyway, right? I mean, confronting modernity, in this case, a modernity that has been affected by this event, which again, I want to just kind of put it in context as an American, as somebody, you know, who was both personally affected by 9/11. I'm Iranian, I'm Muslim, and I'm American. I mean, all three of those things had a huge effect on me as a result of 9/11. But I feel like again and again I need to put it in perspective, because while it has had global ripples, there's no question about it. While it is true that everybody on Earth has had to deal with the consequences of 9/11, whether they had anything to do with it or not, because the United States is such a behemoth. I mean, we are a dinosaur. If we move, if we cough, the rest of the world, you know, gets sick. That's what happens. But nevertheless, this was an event in which 3,000 Americans have died. That's a lot, but in context, I mean, just in the last 4 years of drone attacks, we've killed almost 5,000 Pakistanis. So 3,000 is a lot, but it's not that much. And so to sort of talk about it as this globally, generationally defining thing, I have to say, makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. But nevertheless, in the context of the arts, of the literature, that's, as we've been saying, the role of the artist is to create meaning, create sense out of these big events, but to do so at the individual level, to bring it down to the ground, to tell small stories about large events.
You know, here I want to suggest that the role of the artist is not only to talk about the individual, but to talk about groups, to talk about movements in society, to talk about communities. That has always been the case. I mean, from the very earliest literary works to the poems I read now. If poetry is in fact something that has always been associated with the individual voice, the poems I've read now are so much about a whole community or a society affected. And whereas I completely agree with you that much more needs to be done, and the United States often, like many empires, has a way of enlarging its own disasters so that they begin to look bigger than everyone else's, which is not true and not historically valid. There is a way, I think, in which 9/11 said something about the small things of life. Just think about this. I think it was some American bureau, the Bureau of Statistics, I can't remember, you would probably know, suggested that the entire cost of the attack was something like $200,000 to $300,000. The entire attack, all the training of these pilots, the cutters, what they used, the cost of that whole thing was $300,000. On the other hand, the cost of cleaning up New York in the first week, was it something like 94 billion? So huge. So I think what we actually also learned from 9/11 is that in this age of big technology, of big buildings, of bigness, huge economies, sometimes the small things can be lethal or potent. And I think this is a notion of scale that 9/11 certainly taught me. That the most powerful are not the people with the biggest guns. The most powerful may be those who create, and I'm not supporting terrorism for 1 minute. I do not support it. I understand the reasons why some people are driven to it. I do not support the death of civilians in the public realm. I am against it. However, 9/11 taught us that we need to think differently, not always in the context of major controls, instruments, huge new technology, that there is a whole other vocabulary, there is a whole other mode of action, which deals still with smaller things, older things, and we cannot keep on ignoring that by saying we live in a world of new technology, new machines. And I think that's one of the extremely important lessons taught to us in a very unfortunate way. But I think we cannot now afford to forget it.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. It brings me back to something that Osama bin Laden said himself in an interview with an Al Jazeera reporter. This was in 1997, so it was quite before the 9/11 attacks. But it was after he had already declared his famous fatwa war against the United States. The question that was posed to him was essentially, isn't this just some fantasy? I mean, do you really think that you and your ragtag bunch of cave dwellers are going to defeat the greatest military force in the world, the greatest army that has ever been assembled? And bin Laden's answer was so instructive at the time that if any American policymakers would have even read this interview, I think that the war on terror would have had a completely different outcome. What bin Laden said, and some of you may remember this, was, we don't need to defeat the United States. All I'm going to do, and he pointed to a dune in the distance, he said, all I'm going to do is take 2 of our mujahideen, 2 of our jihad fighters, with a flag that says Al-Qaeda, and I'm going to put them behind that dune, and I'm going to wait for America to come, and then I'm going to bleed it dry. I'm going to bleed it to the point of bankruptcy. So yes, it did cost almost $100 billion to clean up after 9/11, but we've spent more than $1 trillion on the war of terror to the point where we are bankrupt. In fact, it worked. Bin Laden's plan actually worked. The United States is in the midst of one of the greatest economic collapse that it has seen in almost a century, and a huge part of this isn't just the mortgage crisis, isn't the banking crisis. We were far in debt before those things happened. A huge part of this is the $1 trillion that we have spent in a war against an enemy that cannot be easily defined and therefore not easily defeated.
Yeah, which is why I said that in a way 9/11 is an event without a settled frame around it. But Reza, let's try and talk about some of the effects of 9/11. We've dwelt on the conditions, we've dwelt on the negativity, we've dwelt on the vanity of great powers. One of the interesting things about one of the lasting effects of 9/11, I think, and I wonder what you think of this, was in fact to show up internally in America what were some of the problems of what we call democracy. So that in trying to deal with 9/11, there was immediately a conflict between civil rights and the question of security. How far can you push security apparatuses, security instruments, and not touch one's civil rights? So there was, many of the internal issues, many of the internal problems became very central. The other issue was the limitations of policy thinking, particularly when it deals with other cultures, people who come from countries where the economy is very different, where different religions are in play. Almost everybody who wrote about 9/11, including the major report, says that one of the major issues that encourages terrorist attacks is a sense of humiliation on a world stage, particularly when globalization is seen to be giving rich fruits to so many people. There are people who are suffering. There are people who have been made backward because of globalization, not because they were poor earlier. So everybody agrees that humiliation is something that creates the desire for terror. And yet there is no way in which the policy documents can actually take something like humiliation and turn it into a program, into something by which the notion of humiliation can be dealt with, or the notion of shame can be dealt with. All we keep getting is respect other people, respect other people, respect, when what we do is disrespect. So I think many of the crucial issues that were identified as creating the conditions for a kind of vengeful terrorist attack have never really been faced by policy thinkers.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. The problem, of course, with trying to turn this problem of humiliation, this problem of shame, as you say, dignity over and over again coming up as a motivational force for these acts of transnational violence. And by the way, I think that we should definitely make a differentiation there, because there are different kinds of these terrorist organizations. There are the nationalist organizations and transnationalist organizations, and their motivations are quite different. Again, this was the major flaw of George Bush's war on terror, is that it just painted all of these terrorist organizations, whether Al-Qaeda or Hamas or whatever, with a single brush, as though they are all the same, that they have the same motivations, and then therefore they require the same response. That is truly disastrous strategic thinking. Nationalist organizations that turn to terror often do so as a result of deprivation, as a result of a lack of socioeconomic development. That has a huge role to play with why you join Hezbollah, or why you join Hamas, or why you join the Taliban, etc. But transnational organizations like Al-Qaeda are not groups that are motivated by deprivation. These are not poor people. They're not uneducated and illiterate. On the contrary, they're majority middle class. They're fairly well educated. Many of them have higher degrees, graduate degrees, some PhDs. They're globalized. They have enormous knowledge about the world. Their sense of frustration and anger, and the reason that they turn to violence, isn't a result of a lack of socioeconomic options. It's a result of precisely what you're saying, something far deeper, something far more nebulous, a notion of a lack of dignity, a sense of shame and humiliation. And that becomes very difficult for policymakers to address. If you're trying to figure out how to deal with a transnational organization that is motivated by these psychological issues, what exactly do you put in place? How do you change policy to actually address these kinds of issues when your primary concern as an American policymaker, and this is true for policymakers of whatever nationality, your primary concern is maintaining your national interests? That's all America cares about. It's all India cares about. All our governments care about, frankly, all they should care about, is maintaining their country's national and economic interests and nothing else. Now, those interests will often, conflict with the interests of other peoples, of other nations. Those interests often result in disastrous policies. Those interests result in creating precisely the kinds of soil that then give rise to both national and transnational terror organizations. But it is what it is. That's what they are elected to do, and that's what they do. So this becomes an impossible situation in many cases when you're dealing not with fundamental things that you can change, government that can be replaced, development that can be fostered, but dealing with an organization that is acting out of deep emotional and psychological issues. I mean, in some ways, there is no answer to that.
Let me just add something to that. I brought up, and I'm so glad you elaborated on it, I brought up the issue of humiliation, because we know that there are conventions, human rights conventions, to do with dignity, based on dignity, and yet every time there is a human rights problem, there are some people who have dignity and other people who don't have dignity according to it, and that's a very problematic thing. But with something like humiliation, with something like shame, the two affects that I brought up, which are also political issues, I want to tie that to what you said about the transnational. Because when you see conflict as national, even if it's terrorist conflict as national, you always assume that the interest is a certain kind of patriotic interest. It's an interest which is to do with your nation. When you begin to see transnational movements have a very different kind of solidarity. It is true that many of the agents of the terrorism were not people who were deprived of anything. They had Western educations and so on. But they saw themselves as representatives of a larger solidarity, a global solidarity, a transnational solidarity. The Ummah is not something restricted to Muslim societies. The Ummah is the notion of a belonging, a spatial territorial belonging of the Muslim community wherever you might be. When you have those movements and people feel that they have been in some way done down, then I think these more negative social affects like shame, like embarrassment, like humiliation become prominent rather than the dominant patriotic notions of pride in one's country and so on. But what institutions, I think the issue is what kind of political recognition, what sort of institutional recognition do we give to these political emotions? And how do we integrate them into a program of national and international amelioration? That's the issue.
Right. That's a very good question. I actually wrote a book on this very same topic called How to Win a Cosmic War. And at the heart of this is that if you're a nationalist organization, then what creates your solidarity amongst your group, your collective identity, is language, obviously, culture, obviously, nationalism. You share all those things together. It's not hard to figure out who is us and who is them. Us is the people in our nation, them is everybody else. But if you're a transnational organization, then how do you create solidarity? How do you create a collective identity when you have different nationalities, different languages, different ethnicities, different cultures, even different religions? I mean, we like to think of Al-Qaeda as a Sunni fundamentalist religious tradition, but actually within it, there are multiple different schools of thought, schools of law. There is a diversity even amongst these sort of very fundamentalist religious movements. So if you're a transnational organization, the only way that you can create collective identity, the only way that you can define who is us and who is them, is by relying on a common set of grievances. And those grievances, in many ways, have to be as broad as possible because you want your group to be as big as possible. This is really fascinating, but if you read a lot of these great Al-Qaeda theorists, Abu Musab as-Suri or Ayman Zawahiri, or even if you read some of bin Laden's speeches and interviews, what you get is this incredibly wide array, this disparate array of grievances around which they define themselves. Yes, there are the greatest hits, the suffering of the Palestinians, the presence of American troops in the Middle East, Western cultural hegemony. Those are the ones that you hear all the time. But if you read some of these writings, the other things that they complain about are sometimes so mind-boggling in their randomness that it's hard to make any sense of. So, for instance, bin Laden has railed against the United States for refusing to sign the Kyoto protocols that monitor climate change. Yeah, that's right. Bin Laden was green, if you didn't know about that. Ayman Zawahiri has repeatedly excoriated the United States for not signing on to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, as though international justice is on the top of Al-Qaeda's wish list. These are, in fact, Al-Qaeda actually released, it wasn't a fatwa, but it was an official document complaining about the lack of transparency in America's electoral laws after the Bush v. Gore debacle. Yeah. Now, you have to understand that these are not actual things that these people care about, okay? American electoral law is not a primary concern of Ayman Zawahiri, but it is a concern of Americans, and particularly disenfranchised Americans. And the way that if you're a transnational movement and you want to create a sense of identity, you have to throw as wide a net as possible around as many people as possible, because the only way that we can connect with each other is if we have the same grievances, if we have the same complaints. And so the leaders of that movement need to make sure that those complaints are big enough, wide enough, that they can include a large number of people. So this goes to the very good question that Homi asked, which is, well, then what do we do? I mean, how do we actually move forward on policies that address these organizations when what is at stake seems to be emotional, psychological, and sometimes random? Well, the simple answer to this is that you address the grievances. Yes, it's true that for these groups, the grievances are just symbols. They're just something to rally around more than anything else. You think Al-Qaeda actually gives a damn about the plight of the Palestinians? They're an anti-nationalist organization. They don't want to see the birth of Palestine any more than they wanted to see the birth of Israel. For them, it's just a symbol. But that doesn't make it any less legitimate. It's still a legitimate grievance. And if you want to defang the organization, if you want to take power away from a transnational organization, it's almost impossible to deal with the organization itself, but it's not impossible to deal with the grievances that empower the organization. And so that's, I think, the fundamental challenge.
Yeah, but the issue is that many of these demands, this is the paradox, many of these demands of transnational organizations require the apparatus of the nation state. That's the internal. They see themselves as transnational. They raise these issues for all of humankind. But in fact, to make these changes, you have to have the national economy. You have to have national governments. So the issue, I think, that, and since this is a panel on literature, and we could bring it back to that before we open up to some questions, I think what the literary contributions of 9/11 have been very, very subtle. 9/11 novels, 9/11 poems are not focused on 9/11. They are focused on the way in which the politics of 9/11, the actual impact of the event, such as the poems I read you at the beginning, have changed the lives of people, the way they relate to each other. And I think that the death of 3,000 people is appalling, but I agree with you. On a world historical scale, this is not mind-boggling, and in terms of American foreign policy itself, it is minimal. But for some reason, and I think it may be the ambiguity of the event itself. It's not a national event. It is difficult to frame the event. It's an impact on the everyday. What literature has kept alive, what literature has really kept alive, is how that event should make us rethink our personal lives. And although the event may be in the world historical scale small, its effect through ethics, morality, literature has been long, because it has really put the personal and the political, the private and the public, under a kind of mirror of interrogation and under a mirror of questioning. It has created a new empathy. Literature has created a new empathy. Now, I've been asked that we have to end the session, or can we start the questions? Questions. Let us have some questions. Please circulate the mic widely. It's very difficult for us to spot the questioners, but they don't spot themselves.
Question is for Professor Homi Bhabha. You just said that the literature is not focused on 9/11 itself, but on the impact. So I was wondering if you could really define if there is such a thing as a post-9/11 novel in America. What is it? Is it every novel written after 9/11?
No, you're absolutely right. No, not every novel written after 9/11. But if you read most of the novels, like Amy Waldman's Submissions, if you read the novel called The Remainder, I forget the name of the writer, I'm sure many of you will know, The Remainder, or Claire Massoud's remarkable The Emperor's Children, you will always find that 9/11, it's not simply about the event. It's about the implications of the event in the moral and political consciousness of people around it. If you read, as you mentioned quite rightly, Reza, if you read Ian McEwan's Saturday, as you said, it's a kind of Mrs. Dalloway novel. This wealthy doctor is trying to organize a dinner party for his whole family. Then it is set in 9/11 on a day on which there is a march against the Iraq war. So the setting is an implication of 9/11 or a consequence of it. But then, through that, a whole indirectly, the relationship between the father and the daughter becomes the tension between them. It's focused then again on the Iraq war. So what I'm saying to you is that what 9/11 has done has complicated the borderline between what is personal and private and what is public and political. And that's why I think the literature of 9/11, rather than the historical records, have a lesson to teach for much longer and much deeper than very many of the initial shocking, problematic texts.
Yes. You see, you are saying that terrorist is born due to shame and humiliation. Now, why this shame and humiliation in 98% cases is confined to Muslims only? One thing. Is it not true that in every religion there comes a stage when that religion takes the negative aspects of religion and gives up the positive aspects? Even among Hindus, when Ibn Battuta visited India, he saw the woman being was burnt with her husband. He fainted. That was the negative aspect of Hinduism. Now they have taken the positive side. Now why it is that 98% cases it is the Muslim who feels ashamed, who feels humiliated, and who takes to terrorism?
Well, frankly, the 98% is something you just pulled out of your pocket. I don't know what you're talking about. And this notion that that the majority of terrorist actions in the world are by Muslims is frankly just, and I mean this in the greatest respect, idiotic. Islam has no monopoly whatsoever on terror around the world. In fact, in the country in which we are sitting right now, we should know that Muslims do not have a monopoly on violence and terror, unless you have not been paying attention to anything that's been going on. Whether you're talking about the Catholic IRA or the Hindu Tamil Tigers, or whether you're talking about Shurintu, the Shinto-inspired terrorists in Japan who have been responsible for the deaths of dozens of civilians, whether you're talking about Marxist groups like the Mujahideen occult,
the Latin American group.
Yeah, of course, all through the FARC, exactly. This idea that somehow 98% of terrorism is done by Muslims is just this made up fact that people throw around. It has no basis in reality whatsoever.
But it's not even a made up fact. It is a number conjured up.
Yeah,
98%.
Yeah.
Who did the counting? Who
And
did
one
the
more-
counting?
and-
Where does the statistic come from?
And let me just say,
Don't shout.
I
Don't shout.
just named you five. I just named you 5 religions. Okay. The other thing too is that this, on a larger scale, the idea that religion itself is the problem. Yes, it's certainly true that religion, by promoting a sense of absolutism, can often result in violent actions. Obviously, if you believe that there is only one path, there's only one truth, only one path, only one way, then those who reject those ways are going to be people that you are going to probably fight against. But religion is just an ideology. It is no different than nationalism, than socialism. And as a matter of fact, just in the last 100 years, just this last 100 years of human civilization, which, number one, has been the most violent, most bestial century in human existence, but number two, the majority of these actions, the vast majority of the senseless acts of violence, death, and destruction that have occurred in the last 100 years have been in the name of secularism. Marxism, Maoism, Stalinism, socialism, Nazism. These are secularist ideologies that have been responsible for the murder of tens of millions of people. And in the case of Stalinism and Maoism, they're not just secularist, they're anti-religion ideologies. So let's just get our heads out of the clouds for a moment here. Human beings do not need a reason to kill each other, okay? Whether it's nationalism, patriotism, socialism, culture, ethnicity, or religion, it doesn't matter, okay? We will kill each other. So the fact that we use religion to do so doesn't mean that there is something inherently in religion in general or one religion in particular, okay? We are more sophisticated than that. Let's try to pretend that we are.
But there is something actually, Reza, there is something that I think we have to confront about religious politics. I'm not talking about necessarily only about theology. That for the longest time, the question of martyrdom for a cause has had a religious history. Now the terrible, so people from religion don't expect that. But martyrdom has had a long religious history. It started with the Jewish martyrs, then the Christian martyrs, going right back to the beginning of Christianity. The idea that it's something very particular to Muslims is what is wrong. It is not that martyrdom isn't a part of religion. And I think that is something that really needs dealing with. Because this idea that if you kill yourself for a religious cause, you are doing something close to the will of God. And that has got a history, as I say, a political, theological history, and we have to acknowledge that. I think that is a real one of the problems. We don't associate religion with that. But it is there. And I don't think we cannot acknowledge that.
No, I think that's... And by no means am I not acknowledging it. I'm just saying it's not unique or special
No, it's
to
not,
religion.
No, it is not unique or special. But it is not... You don't usually think that dying in the name of God is the thing you ought to do. And there is a way in which religious and theological politics can lead to that. Which is why I think secularism, where the debts of secularism are terrible. But they are of a different kind. And I'm not suggesting they're better or worse.
Maybe it's because I live in the United States, where patriotism is a religion, where the flag is a religious object, and where the Constitution is more valued than Scripture. In fact, it's seen as Scripture. When we send our young men and women to war, wars that we usually don't, I do not agree with. Somebody who dies in a war is considered a hero for us. And yes, it is a kind of secular martyrdom. It's not just religion that has a monopoly on the idea of dying for one's beliefs.
Yeah, but here, I'm more sympathetic to your way of saying we shouldn't see the world from the American perspective.
Yes, thank you, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, can I speak up, please?
Please.
I was in New York 1 year after 9/11, and I saw the first so-called anniversary rituals that were happening. And I felt the common person was so deeply affected at an introspective level. They didn't want America to go to war. Somewhere the common man could see where this was going. It was a dark tunnel, and Mahatma Gandhi had years ago said an eye for an eye will only make the world blind. So I took part in a protest march where everybody was wearing a sign that said, "Our grief is not a cry for war." And I think that was reported very widely. Still, America went ahead and spent $1 trillion plus on so-called war against terror. So it's violence perpetuating violence again. So my question to you, as somebody who's from India, I'm seeing our cinema reflecting introspection. We had a film called My Name is Khan. We had a Pakistani film called Khuda Ke Liye, which is for the sake of God. And it's the same voice, it's the same message. Our grief is not a cry for war. So I just wanted you to respond.
Well, I thank you very much for reminding us of that. Thank you. And I think that what I was saying about the literature of 9/11 is precisely about that. Self-questioning. If you don't question yourself, then you do extraordinary renditions in other countries. If you took this as a learning experience, you don't do that. You're absolutely right, and I have nothing to add to your response except to agree with it. And I think that the arts are self-reflective, self-questioning in that way. In fact, Reza said that in his opening statement. So I think that's an excellent contribution. We don't have much time. I would like to take a few more. We should take a few more questions, I think, because we have to. There's one here, please. Yeah, there's a lady very anxious to ask a question.
Excuse me, I had the mic, so can I?
Yes, of course. Who has the mic?
Yeah.
Please stand up. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Coming back to literature, 9/11 literature, how has 9/11 changed the construction of the identity of the protagonist in literature? And I'm referring to Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, where you have written extensively about identity.
Maybe we take a couple of questions.
Yeah, let's take a couple of questions.
Hello? Yeah. Sir, the Iranian president, even after 10 years of 9/11, makes an outlandish statement insinuating that the US state administration was complicit in the 9/11 attacks. So do you think such outlandish statements, such preposterous statements are ticking bombs for another Patriot Act, for another disastrous policy? How does a US policymaker react to such statements, is my question.
Okay, third one, also literature. You said nations care only about their national interests. Writers care about the human condition. And I'm wondering how you've seen writers pushing beyond national interests. Susan Sontag was vilified for empathizing with what she saw as injustice, the injustice experienced by the attackers. And I'm wondering if you've seen other writers daring to push beyond their national interests in some ways, particularly interested in fiction and poetry.
Well, that's a good question because it connects to the question about the about the protagonist post 9/11, because obviously the job of the writer in telling these small stories is to burrow deeply into the human condition. And if your protagonist is someone, quote, on the other side, then that very easily opens you up to the mindless critics on both sides of the aisle of giving voice to our enemies, etc., etc. And I think Susan's response to that criticism was right on, which is that that's my job. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. And if it makes you uncomfortable, then I've done my job correctly.
Well, let me just talk about the question about identity and the protagonist of 9/11 novel. One of the most important things in 9/11 novels, read across the board, is that the characters are deeply ambivalent and split. They are deeply ambivalent. In fact, in Ian McEwan's Saturday, he talks about his own ambivalence. I think this is a very important thing. In nationalist fiction, there is always somewhere either love the nation or hate the nation. The sort of thing that Bush said, either you're with us or you're against us. The protagonists of 9/11 novels, I can't see the person who are, the protagonists of 9/11 novels say that is too simplistic. It is not that you're with us or against us, but as protagonists, there are parts of our own country, our own culture that are profoundly problematic, and there are other kinds of cultures, there are other kinds of values that we might identify with. To be a questioning person in your own country, to question your own society, to question your own religion is absolutely important. It doesn't mean you hate it. It means that you question it from a position of ambivalence. And most 9/11 novels create these ambivalent protagonists, which is why more conservative reviewers always think they're anti-patriotic. But this is a problem with large countries where they want a kind of hegemony of opinion. They will not take people who say, we believe in this, this is good, but this is problematic, we're going to fight on both sides. In terms of the question, Susan Sontag, I mean, let's give her her words. She said something, it was not simply about anti-nation or prone, again the ambivalence. What Susan Sontag was responding to, very correctly in the last piece she wrote, was people claiming that the terrorists themselves were cowards. And what Susan Sontag said, cowardice is not what you can claim for them or blame them with. Cowardice is when you bomb a country from 40,000 feet. That is cowardice. Cowardice is not, this is not to justify terrorism at all, but to keep the language of nation pure. Don't use cowardice in a wrong way against other people. I think the important thing about national writers, and I think the scene is changing. Nations today, happily, are collections of different forms of ethnicity, interreligiosity. Very often nation states think of themselves now as regional movements, not simply constrained by national territories. I always say globalization begins at home. There are so many diverse peoples living in so many states that in fact the world has, if globalization means anything, it means that our very notion of a pure nationalism, a pure patriotism is now no longer current. It is not what has happened. The diversity issue around the world makes us much more aware of other cultures and other people as neighbors, as living side by side. That, I think, is the positive thing about what we call the diasporic world or the world of migration. We have to think about our neighbors not as if, you know, from America to Africa or India, but the African that is living next door to you in Baltimore, the Asian that is living next door to you in London. That's, I think, the real challenge. That's why the world is now globalized, not because there are many transnational movements, because people are moving in and out all the time in the very place you live.
I have a question for Mr. Reza. Hi, sir. You spoke about us and them, the so-called notion.
My question? Sir?
The so-called notion of national interest. So don't you think as nations, as people, we need to rethink how we locate the nation and how we locate us? Instead of us and them, how we look at the word us. When US looks at us as white American and not as immigrants or as American Muslims, what sort of national interest or notion of nation is it promoting?
Yeah, we're already out of time, but I'll answer that in 30 seconds, which is that is, of course, the promise of globalization, as Homi was saying, that we are moving quickly towards a post-nationalist era in which we are not going to define ourselves by the arbitrary borders that happen to be around us, that we are going to connect to ourselves with post-materialist values based on the things that we hold dear, the interests that we have, not the color of our skins, not the language that we happen to speak, and certainly not by the citizenry that we happen to hold. That's the world that we are on our way towards, and you know, as we say, inshallah, we'll get there.
Yeah, inshallah. And I want to add to that in the United States it's particularly problematic because it is a nation of migrants, and it has been a nation of migrants, and those migrants that are often forgotten, and I would like to remind us, are the Native Americans, the American Indians, and the African Americans. So that the very origin of that nation comes in a way from elsewhere, from Britain, from Africa, from Italy, from Ireland, and so on. And that should be the truth that Americans take away, and that's why America is so attractive, despite all its problems, to people from the rest of the world, because it has that inherent diversity, which I think is the important thing about the global world today. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you.
Many thanks, Reza Aslan and Homi Bhabha, for that fascinating session. Ladies and gentlemen, we now break for tea for half an hour. The evening session starts with Sharmila Tagore and Nasreen Munni Kabir. Thank you. Reza Aslan will be available for book signing where the bookstall is. Please buy his books and get them signed. Thank you.
Just you, just me. If you have any time free, I wanna talk to you. Is all I wanna do all day.
सपना जरूर देखना चाहिए। उत्तराखंड का एक छोटा सा गांव, यहीं से मैंने बहुत बड़े-बड़े सपने देखने शुरू किए। एवरेस्ट क्लाइंब किया था 27 साल पहले। जरूरी आप अचीव करते हैं तो आप दूसरों को भी वहां तक पहुंचाने में अपना योगदान करिए। टाटा स्टील में रह के मुझे वो अपॉर्चुनिटीज मिली। माउंटेनियरिंग के द्वारा लीडरशिप, पहाड़ चढ़ते हैं तो एक नया जीवन, कैन डू स्पिरिट।
टाटा स्टील, वैल्यूज स्ट्रॉन्गर देन स्टील।
अबे पास कर। गाइस कुछ नया दिखाओ। इधर आओ ना यार। वैसे क्या नया दिखाने वाला था तू? नया टेक अवे मेन्यू? नहीं, नया कुकरी शो होगा। नई जलेबी की दुकान। और जलेबी पे नया टॉपिंग। अबे यार, लाइट भी अभी जानी थी यार। नया मोबाइल इंटरनेट मोबाइल पे तेरे उत्तरी रोनाल्डो। क्या कर रहा है? कुछ नहीं, तुम लोग कल देखना टीवी पे पुराना मैच। ए मोटे बड़े, हाँ सुनना, जो तेरा है वो मेरा है यार। जो मेरा है वो तेरा है, जो तेरा है